Okay, let's go to Tanya. We're on page in the beginning of, well, we started already Paracofe last week. We're on in the Tanya, in the English Tanya is 62 on top, and it's 108 at the bottom. Okay, in Paracofe, after the Alter Rebbe basically said what happens when you do a mitzvah and how bad it is when you do an Aveda. Okay. So in Paragraph 8, Alter Rebbe started explaining that's why we can understand that it's not only Kariv Elecha Davar, not only is it close to serve Hashem in thought, speech, and action, but it's Kariv Elecha Davar Ma'oid. It's really very close. And he explains because a person by nature, a Yid by nature, does not want to become separated from Hashem. He can't. Like the Alter Rebbe said, Ayid nishter will and nishter can, not he wants and not he could be separated from Hashem. Because in the other parak, the Alter Rebbe explained that even at the time of sin, gam b'shas hachet, even at the time of the sin, if it's not Avodah Zarah, you're still connected. But the Shechina goes into goats. So now the Alter Rebbe, we're of... Okay, second line from the top of 62. Now, the Rebbe writes that it's very easy for a Jew realizing how bad it is when we sin. So we can understand how important it is that a Jew realizes that they don't want to sin. And he said, if a Jew is willing to give up their life, in the previous chapter, the Rebbe writes, the Rebbe mentioned that a Jew is willing to give up his life, not to bow down to an idol. And then the Alter Rebbe says, but all sins are really idol worshiping. So he said, if people are willing to give up their lives, he says, the kol shekain, second line on top of and the 62. The kol shekain, the shvira satayvus. How much more so with not giving up your life, but breaking your temptation. Hakalami yisurim misa, which is much easier to do than dying, God forbid. So how much more so shekadev elav adavar Yosef. It's so much closer and easier to conquer the Yetzer. Now, the Rebbe is saying, if it's possible that a person is willing to give up his life, not to do Avodah Zarah, and every sin is Avodah Zarah, how much more so and how much easier is it that a person is willing to give up their desires and temptations not to be worshiping idols? And he says, whether it's turning away from evil, meaning not transgressing a negative commandment, even a minute, less important Aveda, which is only rabbinic, that a person should be able to control himself, not to give up his life when he realizes the Alter Rebbe said before, in the previous parak, that any sin a Jew does, at the time you sin, it's idol worshiping. Hashem is standing right in front of us. He says, don't eat it, don't think it, don't say it, and we go ahead and we do it. We're basically denying the entire existence of God. If we would be physically able to visualize Hashem, then we wouldn't sin. Nobody's going to go through a red light if the policeman's watching. Nobody's going to rob a bank if people are looking. So how much more so? And he says, therefore, if a person is willing to give up his life, how much more so should a person be willing to give up his desires and not sin? And he says, here the Alter Rebbe says, even by idol worshiping, you could still do tshuva. Any sin, and he says, I'm going to read a few lines and explain this whole concept over here. Now the Alter Rebbe asks, the Gemara says, there's another Gemara that Alter Rebbe brings on in Gersa Tshuva, another saying of Chazal, that tshuva doesn't help for certain sins. Certain sins, tshuva doesn't help. Another thing the Gemara says tshuva doesn't help, and I'll explain what that means. The Gemara says like this: Echta v'oshuv. If a person says, you know what, I'll sin, and then I'll do tshuva. The Gemara says, "Ein maspikim biyodei lasis tshuva." We don't give him, the literal meaning is, we don't give him the opportunity to do tshuva. And the world defines that. That means you cannot do tshuva. Tshuva is not going to help you. In regards to tshuva, as we mentioned later on, here, he says over there, because the Gemara says that you can't do tshuva. Change tshuva me'elis. Tshuva doesn't help with certain avedas. So the Alter Rebbe says, but what do you mean? Tshuva always helps. The Alter Rebbe says like this. The Gemara says, if somebody says, I'll sin and do tshuva, we don't give him an opportunity to do tshuva. What does that mean? Tshuva, because if a person says, I'm going to sin and do tshuva, that means tshuva was part of the sinning process. It's an advocate of the sin. Why is the person sinning? Because he could do tshuva. That means tshuva is causing him to sin. If the prosecutor cannot become the defense attorney, if tshuva is causing you to sin, then how can you do tshuva in that case? Tshuva is making you sin. So how can tshuva help you for that? So the Alter Rebbe asks, if a person comes along and says, I'm going to sin and I'm going to do tshuva, so then you can't do tshuva. So the Alter Rebbe says, no, that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says tshuva doesn't help. The Gemara says, Ein maspikin biyodei. We don't give him the opportunity to do tshuva. Meaning, Hainu shemachzikim yodei. We don't give the strength in his hand, liasli shasa kesher, to have an appropriate time, lasis tshuva, to do tshuva. I'll explain in a second. Avalam dochek hasha. But if the person pushes himself, okay, and he takes the opportunity, v'asa tshuva, and he does tshuva, nothing stands in the way of tshuva. Meaning like this, a person, Alter Rebbe is saying that even a person sins, okay, but the bottom line, they could do tshuva. So they again reconnecting to Hashem. And he says, even Avodah Zarah, even idol worshiping, you're able to do tshuva. The Gemara says that if you sin with the intent of doing tshuva, you're not going to be able to do tshuva. The Alter Rebbe said that's not what the Gemara says. Normally, the Gemara says, Habal taher Messiah. The Gemara says, if somebody comes to purify themselves, Hashem helps him. Habal taher, if somebody comes to purify themselves, Messiah and Isai, they're from above, they help him. And the Rebbe, which is very interesting, the Rebbe said, the Gemara doesn't say one who purifies himself is helped. The Gemara says, Habal tahir. If somebody is just coming, they didn't even purify themselves. They're coming to purify themselves, Hashem already helps them. Normally, if a person wants to do tshuva, Hashem makes it very easy for him to do tshuva. Hashem helps him. If a person says, I'm going to sin, I'm going to sin and I'm going to do tshuva, because tshuva is causing him to sin, we don't help him doing tshuva. Because again, tshuva was part of the prosecutor. But nevertheless, Alter Rebbe says, if you seize the opportunity and you push, there's nothing that stands in the way of tshuva. So even for Avodah Zarah, you could do tshuva. Any sin that Hashem punishes you, you could do tshuva. We learned in the past, the Neidah Yehuda, that the Rebbe quoted many times. For earthly punishment, when Bezdin kills you or gives you lashes or whatever it is, tshuva doesn't help. Because Bezdin doesn't know what's going on in your heart. You could be a good actor and fake tshuva, and you really don't mean it. So the sin, through the testimony of witnesses, they saw you commit. Tshuva, they don't know if you did or not. You could be a great actor. But Hashem knows when you do tshuva. So when it comes to heavenly punishment, like Avodah Zarah, Hashem knows if you did tshuva or not. So therefore, what Alter Rebbe is saying like this, Echte v'ashuv is just more difficult to do tshuva. And like he quotes later on in the Gersa, there's certain sins that it says you can't do tshuva. And the Reishis Chochmah says what it means is a lower level of tshuva doesn't help. A higher level of tshuva, there is nothing that stands in the way of tshuva. So the Alter Rebbe is saying like this. Why is it easy for a person to do Torah mitzvahs? Because the second way, the shorter way, from chapters 18 on and 17 on, what it means is all you have to do is awaken your natural instinctive love of Hashem. You realize, and you don't have to have Avraham Avinu's love or Yitzchak Avinu's fear. A normal person that has the hidden love of a neshama within them as an inheritance from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. A Jew realizes that every sin, and you don't have to be a brilliant PhD to understand, every sin is a rebellion against God. Every sin is idol worshiping. And if a Jew is willing to give up his life for idol worshiping, how much more so should a Jew be willing to give up his own desires and lusts and temptation that they shouldn't sin, not in thought, not in speech, not in action. But what is it? It's the foolish spirit that comes to the person. But he says, even when you do that, besides Avodah Zarah, even when you sin, you're still a Jew. You're not cut completely. Avodah Zarah cuts you completely. But nevertheless, you can even do tshuva. How do you do tshuva? It's difficult sometimes, but you can still do tshuva. So a person realizes there is no such thing as losing hope on a Jew. There is no such thing as a hopeless Jew. And people for themselves should think, as bad as they are, there's no such thing as I'm hopeless and helpless. There's always a concept of tshuva. A person could do tshuva. Sometimes it's more difficult, sometimes it's less difficult. Every person could do tshuva. If every person could do tshuva, then how far are you away from Hashem already? All you have to do tshuva is awaken this natural instinctive love that we have. And he says, nothing stands in the way of tshuva. And he says, nevertheless, Kol Ish Yisrael, every single Jew, Mochen or Mezumen is prepared and designated. Limser Nafsha al Kedushas Hashem, to sanctify themselves for Hashem. Shleilish Tacha Veis Avodah Zarah. Yet, the Alter Rebbe says like this: even for Avodah Zarah, you can do tshuva, but no Jew says, you know what, I'm going to bow to an idol and then I'm going to do tshuva. It never enters a Jew's mind. Maybe other Avedas, yeah. But he says a Jew is ready not to bow to an idol, even temporarily, but last is tshuva achakach, to do tshuva afterwards. No, it never enters a person's mind to bow down to an idol and then say, you know what, I'm going to do tshuva, I'll be fine. It never enters a person's mind. Why? Because of this godliness, the natural, instinctive neshama that we have, which is above time and place. It's not under the jurisdiction of time and place. Godliness is above time. The shalit umeishal olav, and it controls and rules even time, even your actions. So the Alter Rebbe says the natural instinctive love of a Jew does not allow him to do an Aveda. And by the way, Chassidus, when the Alter Rebbe is speaking here about Avodah Zarah, it's interesting. Chassidus says Really the terminology for idol worshiping is Aveda Salilim, worshiping Elilim or idols, or Avedas Kochavim or Mazalis, worshiping the constellations or whatever. The expression is always Aveda Zara. Aveda Zara means not idol worshiping. The literal meaning of Aveda Zara, Zara means foreign. Aveda Zara, something which is foreign to the Jew. It could be holy. It could be holy. But if it's foreign for the time and place where you need to do what you're doing, it's called Aveda Zara. For instance, if somebody's supposed to be davening, if the minyan's davening, now is the time for davening. And somebody says, you know what, I want to learn. You know what, that's learning is very holy. But the bottom line is, now you're supposed to be davening. If this person's supposed to be learning and now they'll instead go daven, that's very nice. It's wonderful. But the problem is it's foreign because that's not what you're supposed to be doing now. Torah says this is what you need to be doing when you need to do it. And if not, it's Aveda Zara. It's not bowing down to an idol. But the expression in Chazal is Aveda Zara, which means any Aveda which is foreign to the Jew. Okay? So until now, Alter Rebbe spoke about controlling, not transgressing negative commandments. And now he continues about positive commandments. And the same thing when doing good. In other words, to do a mitzvah, not to be lazy. To strengthen ourselves like a lion, like it says in Gibor Kari, it's supposed to be strong like a lion. With strength and the might of the heart, neged hayetzer, to fight the yetzer hara. Hamachbid as gufi, that makes your body heavy, i.e., lazy. Umapul all of atzla, and it gives them laziness from the element of Yeseda Offer Shebenefesh Habamis. In the first parak, the Alter Rebbe spoke about the four elements of the Nefesh Habamis. And he says, anger and haughtiness comes from the element of fire, temptations come from water, boasting, mockery, air things comes from air, and earth. Now the Rebbe says, atzlus, laziness and sadness. How does the Yetzer Hara get a person not to do a positive mitzvah? A negative mitzvah means you want to do it, then you have to fight yourself not to do it. Not doing a positive mitzvah is more passive. I'm just not putting on tefillin, I'm just not davening, I'm just not doing lulav and esrog, whatever. That comes from laziness. I'm just not in the mood. So he says a person has the ability to undo the laziness of the Yetzer Hara to the person. When it wants to make you lazy, that you're not going to be able to be with vitality, enthusiasm, and excitement to do a mitzvah. Especially a mitzvah that has a lot of diligence to it, a lot of work. For instance, lamo b'teira. It says amelim b'teira. Teira is a lot of work. I want you to know something. To sit and learn is more difficult than standing in the street a whole day putting on tefillin with people. It's interesting. When the Rebbe came out with the mitzvah tanks and the mitzvahim and all that, we're all bachrim. And at the beginning, until the Rebbe stopped it, bachrim would be going a whole day. Mamish from morning, as soon as the Rebbe came, the Rebbe would go like this with his hands to all the tanks, and it would go out for the day, and we'd come back at night. And it was hard, standing on your feet the whole day, talking to people, trying to argue with them, getting to put on film. And all the bachrim that were doing both, the guys that learned, and everybody said, it's harder to sit and learn in yeshiva a whole day than standing on your feet in Manhattan putting on film with people. Because you use your head. It's a lot of work. There's iyun teira, amala teira. To have pasik pumim megirsa, that your mouth should not stop learning teira. That's a lot of work. So comes the Yetzer Hara and makes you lazy. Just, come on, it's too hard. You take it easy. Go to sleep. Come on, Merazalik, the Gemara says. A person should act in the way of Torah, which should always submit to the words of Torah, like an oak, like an ox to the yoke, or like the donkey to its load. In other words, you have to be submissive, not give into the Yetzer Hara's laziness. A person needs to have chayas, to be excited, to do what needs to be done. To do what needs to be done in a positive way. That's why, by the way, it's interesting. When you hear about the word Gehenna, you always hear about the hell, the fire, the burning, all that stuff. In Chazal, there's a Gehenna Shel Eish and Gehenna Shel Sheleg. The Alter Rebbe brings it down in time, but the Gemara talks about it. There's a fiery Gehenna and there's a snowy Gehenna. Which one's for what? So the fiery Gehenna is for transgressing negative commandments. And the snow Gehenna is for not doing positive mitzvahs. Why? Just think about it very simply for a second. When you do an Aveda, you do something you're not allowed to do. So you become impure. You become, use the word dirty, but spiritually dirty, spiritually impure. How do you clean dirt? With hot water. You want to clean something, you want to clean the dishes, you usually can't use cold water. You have to use hot water. Hot water takes off dirt. So Gehenna Shel Eish, the fiery Gehenna, is for those Avedas that you did, negative commandments. You became impure. You need to, in order to go to Gan Eden, you need to get a big cleansing. So you go into a boiling hot shower, so to speak, which is Gehenna, boiling hot, and you get cleansed. When you don't keep a positive mitzvah, the sin of a positive mitzvah is, I don't put on tefillin, I don't daven, I don't bench, I don't, whatever the 148 positive mitzvahs. That's not an action, like we just said, it's passive. Why do you transgress a positive mitzvah? Because you're lazy. That means you're sleepy. So how do you get out of sleep? You jump into a freezing mikvah, or you jump into freezing snow, it wakes you up. So the Gehenna of Sheleg, which is for not keeping positive mitzvahs, that's basically, so to speak, it's spiritual. But a freezing Gehenna to wake you up from the sleep that made you not do the positive mitzvahs. And the fiery Gehenna, that's to get you cleansed. So he says, just like you can awaken the pintali, the hidden love, not to transgress any Aveda, because you realize every sin I'm mamish going Aveda Zara. And if people are willing to give up their lives, including us, not to bow down to an idol, how much more so is it easier to give up our temptations? He said the same thing is in positive mitzvahs. Also to daven properly with all your might. That doesn't mean screaming and yelling. It means with all your concentration and all your self. There's a story. There was a chassid that had to go somewhere. And the wagon driver wanted to leave early. So he says to the chassid, when can I pick you up in the morning? With the wagon. He says, I usually try to daven with a minyan. So the wagon driver was a Yid, a simple Jew. So okay, he got up in the morning and, the minyan was, let's say, 7 o'clock. And he davened with the minyan. And this Jew kept on davening, this chassid kept on davening and davening until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So finally the Balagola said, I understand, you told me you'd like to daven with a minyan. He said, what I meant was my internal personal minyan. the 10 powers of my soul. Just like a minyan is 10 Jews. What I meant when I say I try to daven with a minyan, he says, I try to daven with the 10 powers of my soul. My entire being, my whole body, my whole being is davening. That's what he says, to learn with all your power and might, meaning davening completely in it, as if nothing else exists. That's where the Yetzer Hara comes to get in the way. And he says, you can overcome that. V'chein ba'avedas Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe is speaking about Torah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah, which are the 3 pillars. V'chein ba'avedas Hashem shebedavar shebemamin, which is giving tzedakah. K'mei avedas tzedakah k'yetze be'elu, that a person doesn't want to give tzedakah. He doesn't want to give enough tzedakah. He doesn't want to give more tzedakah. What is that? It's also laziness. No, I need the money for myself. He says, these are all the battles of the Yetzer Hara and and the deception of the Yetzer Hara. The kader nefesh adam, to cool down the soul of the person. Not to give away a lot of money, or not to help another Jew with your body, meaning then you're not going to be able to eat or sleep. You're going to be busy helping people. That the Jew has the ability, now forever says, to stand up against this Yetzer Hara of laziness, and to conquer it. Alter Rebbe says, this is very easy. This ability is very easy to every person. How? When he realizes that to conquer the Yetzer Hara, whether it's a negative or positive, and to do exactly the opposite of what the Yetzer Hara wants, is kal ma'od. Next page, is infinitely easier from death. And for death, you would definitely give up your life for Hashem. And yet, if it would come down to bowing down to an idol or giving up your life, the person would be willing, even the Kal Shebekalim, the lowest Jew, when push comes to shove, you can't think you're still Jewish. Okay? The lowest of Jew would have the will, the love and the will, not to become separated at all from Hashem, even temporarily. Again, a Jew would be willing to give up his life not to transgress Avodah Zarah. How much more so? Okay, every positive mitzvah, negative mitzvah, which is Avodah Zarah. Because I'll tell you the truth, even not doing a positive mitzvah is also a form of Avodah Zarah. It's passive Avodah Zarah. It's not active, like Hashem says, don't eat it, and I go eat it. That's actively an action which goes against Hashem. But if I believe Hashem is standing in front of me, and Hashem is telling me now, go daven and go learn, and I'm standing in front of you, okay, the king is standing in front of you, and I want to see your concentration. If a Jew would be standing in the presence of a physical king, and they're asking for their life, okay, let's say an analogy, a king says this person has to get killed, and the person is coming in the presence of the king to beg for his life. Will any foreign thought ever enter that person's mind while he's begging the king for his existence, for his life? No, no way. Think about it. We're davening. What are we davening for? Parnasa, health, happiness, nachas, all good things we're davening for. We're standing in the presence of Hashem. Hashem is standing right in front of me, and my mind is all over the place. Or I decide not to daven. That in a certain way is passive Avodah Zarah, which is just as bad. And now we're going to leave it here. If a person is willing to give up his life, how much more so to give up his laziness and not to be lazy, and to do what he needs to do. So therefore, it's Kari V'Lecha Davar Meid. Really, it's easy for any sin. Okay, Mitzvah Shem Monday night at 8:30. Everybody should have a very good week. Don't forget, tonight's feed is 19. Everybody should have a good Shabbos.
Amen.
We'll see you Mitzvah Shem Monday night.